and welcome to our second episode of February 2021 for the Cinetopia podcast. This is our Glasgow Film Festival special, where we're going to take in depth the festival, what's on offer, and review a few films, interview a director. My name's Amanda. I'm founder of Cinetopia, and I'm here with my co-producer on the show, Jim Ross. How are you, Jim?
I'm good. As ever, probably watching more films than I can keep straight in my head, but some are good, so that's all fine.
You've been on 2 major film festivals this year so far, so you've gotten a lot in this time.
Well, allegedly.
This year.
Allegedly, yeah.
And we're also joined with a regular on our show, and Marc Nelson. Marc, how are you?
Hello, Amanda. Thanks very much. I'm well.
Good. Have you gotten through your? Were you writing some papers as well for school and everything?
I mean, the due date was essentially the same week as the beginning of screenings for Glasgow, so that was fun to juggle. I have also been on a. I'm sure we'll talk about this more, but I've been on an enormous Frederick Wiseman-a-thon in the run up to City Hall. So I think we'll talk about that more once we get to City Hall.
Oh, well, that's great. And I wish I had a little bit more time to do the same. But I'm sure we'll go back to Frederick Wiseman-a-thon at some point in the future as well. And we're back also with Steph is back with us, a regular as well. She was in our previous February edition as well. So Steph, how are you doing over the past couple of weeks?
Hello, Amanda. I've been alright, just suffering through lockdown, but it makes you take in a lot more films, and I think that if you're back to normality, so there is pros and cons. How are you doing?
Not too bad. I've been also juggling work and an edit and the Glasgow Film Festival, and we've started to create some material for Cinescapes. So been doing some interviews around that, which is exciting. And I've been catching up with tons of films on the Glasgow Film Festival sort of press screenings, but we're here to talk about all of that today. So overall, how many films have you guys seen, and what's your overall take so far?
That's a good question, actually. I'm not sure about it. I think at the time of recording, I think I've seen 9. I think, which is quite well. That's quite restrained, though. I mean, Sundance, I think I got to like 18 or 19, so I'll probably have seen a lot more by the time we get to the end. By and large, my impression's pretty good. I think we've picked some good ones to talk about on the show. Without saying anything else, because it'll still be under embargo. There are a couple of films which I'm not that impressed with, if I'm honest. But overall, I think the program looks pretty good, and the ones that we've picked out in particular are good. There are other ones which maybe we'll talk about on later shows when they come around on general release, which are also pretty good. So the overall, and I said this in the interview we had with Alison Gardner, generally speaking, I quite like the way they approach the Glasgow program. So there's definitely a whole bunch of stuff in there that's worth seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I actually really have to say that I don't know if I've been at a ton of these online film festivals, but I found so far that the format and the way everything is playing and whatnot. I know you talked to Alison about the kind of her testing and making sure that so the whole usability, it was quite good, and I've enjoyed it. So I've really had a good time, getting to see these films, and it's been quite easy and quite rewarding. So. I'm looking forward. Let me just mention that the industry program at Glasgow is usually an incredible opportunity for filmmakers. They run a great program in the industry, and that's what I've done for the last couple of years, has been part of that. So if there is still industry passes available, I'm not sure, but just even if you missed out this year, consider it in the future, because I highly recommend what they're able to accomplish at that film festival. Not that other ones I've been to haven't been good as well, but this one was, I think, particularly exemplary. So I hope that will be the same this year. So Marc, how have you been getting along with the film festival so far?
So I think I've seen 19 movies so far, and I think we're just over halfway, or just past halfway, I think, in terms of screenings. And it's been very, very slow so far. I have to be honest. Hopefully, it picks up in the next week. I've seen a film today I can't mention that I think is wonderful, and I think we'll be talking about in in the near future. But yeah, if I continue talking any longer, I'll start moaning. So I'll stop here.
Okay. And Steph, you've seen these films, but yeah, so you've seen at least four, yourself, right?
Yeah, I've seen. I think I've seen a few things from the festival this year. I get, because things come from different companies, I get kind of lost on what's coming from what. But I have seen quite a lot of really good documentaries this year, which I'd never really have the privilege of seeing too much of. So it's been a nice change about festival wise.
So on this special edition, we are going to be reviewing 4 films that are part of the Glasgow Film Festival this year. And the first one is going to be Limbo, which is a Scottish film by filmmaker Ben Sharrock. This, I believe, is his second film. City Hall. It is definitely not Frederick Wiseman's second film. It's probably quite many films that have come back for decades, but that is his latest observational documentary we'll be reviewing. Minari, which is directed by Isaac Chung, is American film, and the film Apples by Christos Nikou. I also had the opportunity to interview the co-director of Poly Styrene, I Am A Cliché, which is a documentary about punk British musician, originally by the name Marianne Joan Elliott Sade. So we'll talk with him later on and hear about that film. So that's this very exciting show, and looking forward to talking to you guys. So the first film we're going to talk about is Limbo by Ben Sharrock.
So basically, the plot of Limbo centres around a young musician called Omar, who has recently sort of migrated to a remote island in Scotland to escape the war in Syria. And there he kind of is part of a cultural awareness programme where he's introduced to a lot of different immigrants who are seeking a better life outside of poverty and famine and war-torn areas. And it's all about how they kind of begin to belong and feel also kind of like a duality between belonging and feeling quite isolated from this culture, and how they kind of integrate themselves and how they build relationships and friendships. And it swings through a lot of comedy, a lot of comedic undertones, and to quite harrowing drama. So it's a very much a balanced film in the way that it explores kind of like the migrant crisis and things like that.
Great. And what are your thoughts on the film?
You know, for a film like this, I've not seen a funnier opening sequence in quite a while than in Limbo. I was in stitches. Obviously people will understand that more when they see it, but the balance of comedy and drama through this film is really quite remarkable, especially, you know, with the subject matter that it's exploring. And I think that the characters in it have, for how kind of condensed the film it is, have so much life about them. And it does centre around the story of four different people who moved recently to this island in Scotland, and how they have to find their own way and find themselves in this completely different place that almost fails to integrate them a little bit. So you have these people that are kind of holding on to these connections that they've made through the most kind of absurd ways, and the way that sort of develops. And it's just, I would recommend everyone to go and see this film. I've not seen Ben Sharrock's film before. I think I'm not sure the title for the one that was made a couple of years ago, but it's made me definitely quite making me quite, you know, I want to urgently seek that out and give it a watch.
So the opening scene grabbed me from the second I saw it, and I think it's a really, really good thing for Steph to bring up there. I honestly don't think I've laughed so much at it. And let's be clear, this is a film that balances comedy and drama, right? So it's not a comedic film as such. But that opening scene, I don't think I've laughed at something so much for quite some time. This is a film which balances tone perfectly, in my opinion, and I think that's the biggest demonstration of that is that opening scene. The tone of it goes a bit more somber. There's a way the tone of the film develops, and it's always balancing humorous aspects of this kind of this refugee experience of being in this completely alien place, really. And I think one thing that I enjoyed quite a lot about that is Scotland, and in particular Scottish filmmakers, have a tendency to romanticise Scotland and the landscape. And that's something which Sharrock's not doing here. It comes across as quite barren and inhospitable, and that kind of gels with the experience of these refugees and Omar in particular throughout the film, and that was an interesting aspect that I actually quite liked. So it's balancing this very stressful experience, this very alienating experience, but also these moments of humour that you find. And there are lots of these absurdist moments which remind me a lot of other filmmakers that I like a lot. You know, I got hints of Roy Anderson off it. I got hints of Elia Suleiman off it. You know, like it's clear to me, I think, that those filmmakers in particular have an influence on this, and that balance of kind of like this very melancholic atmosphere with humour is handled extremely well, and I think the performances underpin it extremely well also. I think it's very difficult to balance the tone of a film the way that Limbo does, and I think it does it extremely well.
Yeah, I like the comparison with Suleiman. I'd also add Aki Kaurismäki is big for this, and there's a massive deadpan element to it, which is important for Omar, and the performance by Amir El Masri I think is wonderful, because he's such a good foil to the effusive Scots who keep putting their foot in their mouth and or just have too much to say, whereas he has nothing to say, and he has the perfect observer profile. Just walking around, he does an awful lot of walking in the movie, and there are these frequent shots of him walking down snowy roads, and it does evoke how long he's been journeying to get to that place. And I would say also that the staging in the film is exquisite. There are these single shots which are multi-planed and have numerous points of drama within them, but he can alternate between long and medium long shot to then going into close-up, and these close-ups have these fantastic sort of leaning into the lens emphases throughout them, and I think they're incredibly moving at instances, particularly when you get to the stories of the two housemates who are pretending to be brothers. One's from Ghana, one's from Nigeria, and they're pretending to be brothers in order to get their asylum claim processed. I'd also say that there's a thing which you often get in films by Suleiman, which is a kind of exaggerated understatement. And there are moments where, for instance, the other housemate, who's called Farad, who's played by Vikash Bai, he has a moment where he's in the classroom, which the film opens with, in that brilliant scene that we've talked about, where he raises his hand. And when he raises his hand, it's like he's doing breaststroke. It's like his arm is out of the socket almost, that he's reaching up so high. But because the camera's so still, the joke registers all the more. And because everybody within the frame are all kind of looking at the camera with this bored, detached look, it just keeps emphasizing and redoubling in significance for me. I should also say, as a still game partisan, I nearly cheered at a certain appearance in the film, in the market, but I'll maybe leave that for folk to discover.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo everything everyone said. It's I mean, the tone is quite amazing to balance everything together, drama and comedy, and it's done so well. I also would say, as you were mentioning, I was really particularly impressed. Of course, when you're in like north and southeast where the filming took place, the Outer Hebrides, it's obviously gorgeous, and quite barren, and that landscape is probably easy to make beautiful, but the way that he used like this negative space in almost all of the landscape shots, there was kind of a real beautiful thematic sort of like way in which all the scenes were. It made me really happy to be in Scotland, and also it felt quite cold and, and barren, as you suggested. But I just think it was a definitively unique way to film Scotland, and it worked so well with the story and what they were trying, the inner sort of like, perspective of someone coming from the outside to this location. And I just I can't say anything that everybody hasn't said but I highly recommend it. It's beautiful.
I think it's worth talking about Amir El Masri's performance as well, actually, and I think especially in the context of something that Marc brought up, which is the use of close-ups in the film, that kind of like that sense that almost kind of like leaning into the lens. And it's one of these films where a lot of the emotions, especially early on in the film, are quite subtle ones. But with that style of shooting your subject, there's really nowhere for you to hide. Like every slight, movement on your face is going to be really rendered in pretty large detail, right? And I think he does an absolutely excellent job, because on top of that, we've mentioned about the sort of like the deadpan tone, and Amir El Masri is kind of in most of the, if not every scene actually, but like most of the scenes, and really has to sell that tone. And I think the other person who does it extremely well is Vikash Bai as Farhad. In particular, a lot of the subtle stuff that goes on with him later in the film. I think both of those performances in particular are standout ones. But frankly, all the supporting performances have to do it as well. There's a lot of segments where I struggle to see how people kept a straight face doing it, and that kind of goes for the comedic moments as well as some of the more emotional moments. So I think the filmmaking itself, in terms of kind of the form of it, is extremely accomplished, and it tells that story visually very well. But I think the performances that Ben Sharrock has got out of the actors as well, it's one of these things where they just come together really quite effectively. And I think that a lot's going to focus on the form of it, and I think understandably, right, because it is very good. But I don't think the way that's blended with the performances should be overlooked, because that's what makes, for me, that's what makes the film work as a whole.
Yeah, and it's that thing you said, Jim, about there being nowhere to hide is interesting, because from that opening scene, which is so much the joke in that opening scene, which I won't mention because it's so good, is essentially kind of turns on the extent to which the people in the scene are performing within a performance. And that's crucial for the film, I think, because it's so much about learning to act a certain way. And his passivity is actually a kind of a rejection. It's kind of a way of saying no to certain slights that are handed his way, certain assumptions that are made of him. I like, too, the idea that this is a Scottish movie which sort of overturns the cliche of Scotland as this great utopian nation. And I think it's fair to say it's a country with numerous issues about prejudice, as every country has, and this has a particularly clear way of dramatizing that. And I also like to mention something Amanda said about the use of negative space without going too far towards the ending. There's a change in the way the images are the images are arranged in the final parts of the film, and I think that speaks to Sharrock's conception of Omar's selfhood and how he gradually walks toward a certain vision of selfhood that was denied him earlier in the film. And also just want to mention that it'll probably become one of these classic slapstick sequences, but the Royal Mail van, which makes its merry way up to their house, possibly with a letter confirming asylum in the country, that's one of the standout scenes in the film for me, in the way that it constantly goads you to laugh at it, but it's actually very sad and very desperate. And the fact that they're standing at the end of their driveway it's a horrible image of the four of them in the frame crammed together, but still manages to be extremely funny and play on a certain kind of formal humor involving the music, which another film we'll cover today does not do so well. And I love that scene, and I think I love the film. Although I will say there are parts where he's playing the oud, the instrument that he plays, where it goes into these kind of associative montages, and it kind of hammers home the idea that the oud is the link to home for him. And I want to watch the film again to see if I wasn't missing something of an emotional note in these scenes, because I felt a little bit cold towards them. But I think my intuition is that there's something right here that I missed on first watch, but I'm already looking forward to seeing it again.
I think also to go back to the performances, particularly of Omar and Farhad, I think that there seems to be, it's difficult in these films, are quite almost kind of ruminate through absurdist and slapstick humour, and I think it's so difficult when you've got a script that jumps through all these kind of hoops with drama and kind of trying to find that equilibrium between the tones, that these characters would bounce off each other so well. It almost seems like when I was watching it, I was wondering, is there been quite a bit of leeway with the script? Has there been quite a lot of improv happening on set? Has there been, because there's, the humour within it kind of is very much quite British, and I think when we say that, we don't really know what that means. What do you mean by British humour? But I think if you watch the way that it channels kind of these small moments throughout, and the way that they kind of follow each other to lead to something later on, I think the more that you pick up through these characters, and the more that the story kind of comes through on this barren, remote island and stuff, it's very much a film that kind of almost manages to capture an atmosphere that you wouldn't expect to be there from the way that it's shot. It's a very interesting film, and I think that you can't downplay how the performances have kind of brought those to the forefront. I think that a lot of that is with the performances of these characters to make the kind of deadpan humour that kind of sails it through, how powerful it really is.
Great. So we highly recommend you check this film out, Limbo. It's going to be at Glasgow Film Festival online, and we'll make sure that the links are in the description as well. So the next film we're going to review is Minari, directed by Isaac Chung. And Marc, do you want to give us a little bit of an intro to that film?
Sure thing. So, as we mentioned, it's the Isaac Chung's film Minari. It's about a family, the Yees, who move from California, where Jacob, who's played by Stephen Yeun, and Monica, who's played by Han Ye-ri, work in sort of chick sexing factories. And they move out from California, where arguments tell us that they have been having discussions about money, because they need to send money back to Korea, from which they've emigrated. And their children, who are born in America, they come with them. They are little David, who's played by Alan Kim, and Anne as well, who's played by No Kate Cho. So they move to Arkansas, and it's part of Jacob's vision for their life there that he will take over this huge plot of land and farm Korean vegetables. And he puts all of his energy into this task, leaving somewhat of a gap between him and Monica, and the kids do their thing, up until the arrival of their grandmother, who causes a bit of friction between husband and wife, and David doesn't really get on with her either. He sees her as not a real grandma because she doesn't bake cookies. She's called Sunya, and she's played by Yoon Ye-jung. There's also a neighbor character who kind of gravitates towards the family and starts helping out in the land, who's called Paul, but he's played by Will Patton, and he's a Christian mystic, I think you'd say. He speaks in tongues on occasion, and he's very effusive, but he was also a Korean War vet, so he sees that as a connection between him and the Yees. I'll leave off on exactly what I think about the film until we all get a word in. So, Steph, what do you think about Minari?
I really like Minari quite a lot. I think it's refreshing to see a film about sort of not so much migration since I think when we talk about jumping country to country, but going up from to Arkansas to almost build a new life. Kind of when we see these films, it's always very much centered around the American dream and how the American dream is an illusion and how it's never going to hold up to the. Sorry. I loved Minari. I think that it's really nice to have one of these films that when we're talking about kind of doesn't go straight into the American dream. We think when you have something about people fleeing towards, in this film in particular, going to Arkansas to gain a more prosperous life, to find something that makes them feel kind of purposeful in the grounds that they live upon. And it's one of those things that for once we don't have the whole, is the American dream an illusion, is it all letting us down, because we have that's the kind of narrative that we expect from these films. And this one focuses much more on the family at the core of it, and what it means to kind of take these roots from from Korea into America, and how it's difficult to kind of make your mark on a new location, and how you can contribute to it. And I think you see that a lot in the family dynamics between, the husband and the wife, and there are two separate visions for what they want out of this move, and especially what David and the influence of the grandmother kind of alters that for him, and how that becomes a big conflict in the centre and continues to meander through almost turbulent waves in the way that they digest this part of their lives and things. I definitely would say that it's definitely a film that is a different way to explore this narrative that we've seen in so many films before. What did you think of the film, Jim?
So yeah, this is a film I liked a lot. It does meander at points, I think, is really my only criticism of it. There are a few points where the rural Arkansas backdrop and kind of the sun and wandering through the fields and kind of the very emotive score, there are a couple of moments where I think it maybe meanders a little bit, if I'm being honest. However, by and large, I found it a very engaging and, for me, refreshing film. Now, part of that is because we're dealing with a family where we've got Korean-born parents who have moved to America, and then we've got kids who, converse in Korean but are American. They were born in America. They have no real experience of Korea. And a lot of the cultural clashes that come up in this film, they are refreshingly, for me, I think, they're not with the Arkansas residents of the 1980s, because that would be a reasonably easy and perhaps more acidic route to go with this, but it's actually far more to do with the culture clashes within the family itself. In particular, the kids, in particular, David, played by Alan Kim, the youngest, the little boy, he has so many scenes with his grandmother, Sunya, played by Yoo Young Yoon, where it's actually really, really very funny, in a sort of quite hurtful way at times. And I think the way it plays the generational differences between, say, Sunya and her daughter Monica, the clashes kind of culturally even between Monica and her husband Jacob, the cultural clashes between the kids and the grandmother, the kids and the parents. I think the way it navigates all these things in the script is extremely well done, and it's another one of these films that's doing a delicate balancing act. Something that actually reminded me of a little bit in that respect was another film that we reviewed on the show a while ago in Miss Juneteenth, Now, the reason I bring that up is because it's another one of these films where to watch it, it doesn't look like there's necessarily a lot of hard work going on, but in order to balance the different perspectives and still tell a story within that is actually quite, for me anyway, quite skillfully done. So for me, I found it really very good. I don't think it's one of these films where I don't necessarily there's lots of things that I'm sure you could pick out from it as a a message or of any other thing, but really at its core, I think it's just quite a well told story, and it does that very deftly using the relationships between the different members of that family and also some of the folk around them, such as the Paul character played by Will Patton and so on. So yeah, I personally got a lot out of this.
It's strange. The one, if I had to offer, I suppose, any criticism to this film, and I did thoroughly enjoy it, I loved how it's centered on the family. What confused me a little bit is because we have such a focal point about young David and his grandmother, and then on the sidelines we have the conflicts between the husband and wife, the father and mother, about what they're searching for in this move. And I it makes me, it's kind of weird to find out where the sister sort of fits into that. She's sort of a character that kind of, I suppose you could say, is quite a mediator between the relationship between David and his grandmother and between her mother and father, but she doesn't really serve much purpose in the movie other than to, I suppose, establish like a family unit to maybe balance it out. It was one of the things when I was watching it where I was sort of looking for her to have her story and was a bit confused when she didn't really have one. She existed sort of somewhere in between everyone else's. And I think when you're doing a story that is centered on a family unit and their reflection of their kind of migration to this new life, it's strange that her story wouldn't be included. I think that was one of the things that I was a bit disappointed in, but not enough to not keep my attention on everything else that was going on. But it is one of those things that I did notice, which just because it was a little bit strange, to be honest, when I was seeing it. I don't know if anyone else felt that way with that character, or maybe just something that was lingering.
I don't know if I don't know if I totally agree. I guess she plays this role of someone who gets largely, I mean, you kind of have the younger son who has kind of the personality and is grappling with the frustration with additions to the family, and she's kind of trying to be the responsible one, the left alone, while the parents work. So I felt that kind of character was kind of strong. I mean, she was always trying to take them to church, and she was always trying to, I don't know. I really did grasp her character. I really did. I kind of very much enjoyed it. It was quite subtle, but I think the whole film is quite subtle, and I think that's kind of the point. The point is, and I think you bringing up Miss Juneteenth, I was thinking about the fact that that film kind of explores multiple characters and the family, and no one's kind of vilified in a sense, so everyone here is going through a certain, complication, and it isn't about the outside world, like you said. I mean, it is, the outside world is is the getting used to and making it home, but the internal issues are what kind of is driving the story. So in that way, I think, like you said, it's quite lovely. I guess I had heard a lot about this film, like just in the fact that I guess it was a big deal at Sundance, and then there was this recent controversy over, what category it was in the Golden Globes and whatnot, which I'm sure Jim has comments on.
I'm biting my tongue. Yeah. I'm biting my tongue.
But I that's one of those things where I wish I hadn't maybe had that information before. Best thing to come out of Sundance. Because maybe I had different expectations. I liked it, but I thought it, like you said, maybe sometimes it was meandering. I don't know if it was meandering as much as it was just a quiet film. It was a quiet film about a family and and a story about in the 80s. I'm in a quite enjoyed the church scene where they're just bored, and I just thought about the times my parents took me to church, and I wish I had a phone. Now, like, too bad I grew up. Well, I didn't grow up in the 80s, but still, Anyway, so it was good. It really is good. I don't know if it's the best film I've seen this year, but I enjoyed it.
I kind of agree with Steph's point, and I also see where it's meant to fit in the narrative too, because I think it's got to do with David's heart murmur, and the fact that because he's so unwell, the parents have kind of channeled a lot of their energy into him, and Anne's had to be self-reliant in a way. But that said, the movie does move away from David's perspective at times. It kind of begins with his point of view looking in the rearview mirror, but it does move away from him at moments, and why it didn't move to her as part of those movements, yeah, I can see that that's an omission in the film's, like, emotional structure in a way. I have to say that I've seen it twice now, and on first viewing I really didn't get on with it. I found it really cold and quite jarring in a way that I had to see again to try and tease out the reasons why. And I think it's useful to contrast this and the fact of why I didn't like it with the film, which I feel like it's in some ways similar to in design, which is Lulu Wang's The Farewell, which is a film that I really don't get on with because I think there's nary a good performance in the film, to be quite honest. But it's a film whose design I quite like. Exactly the opposite here, which is the performances are probably one exception, top to bottom, wonderful. And the design I don't really get on with, because the design of the film kind of moves through. I think the first hour is lovely. First hour is full of a lot of the understated touches that we've been talking about so far, and it's full of excellent performances, as I say. I think the standout is Hanye Ree as Monica. I think she's absolutely tremendous. She can hold a close-up like no one else in that film. She has these reserves of anger and frustration and boredom that kind of come in waves, and I think they're so incredibly evoked by like the way she kind of shifts her stance, or the way that she kind of her frown begins, or numerous things that she uses in her expressive toolkit that I just think are extraordinary. I think it's the best performance in the film. But what happens after that first hour is things start going downhill for the farming, the prospect of their farming, and once that happens, the film invites this kind of steady decline in terms of the family's emotional security, and then seems as though it's going to sort of swing up and gradually effloresce into feeling again. And I don't feel like it did that in a way, because part of what Lee Isaac Chung's style demands is this variation between long shot and closer shots. And at times he's putting a wee bit too much of a frame on an interaction. So if the performances are wonderful, there are scenes where the performances are kind of like almost subtracted as an element from the scene. For instance, I'm thinking of when Sunya arrives in the house, and they have this scene where she hands to her daughter chilies and anchovies from Korea, and they're like, and she cries because these are reminders of home, or an old home. And what happens there is that the way that it's staged is that there's this door frame in the way, and it puts too much of a comment on the performances and doesn't actually let them perform, to me, when the performances are the best thing. Why take away from your actors in that way? And I'll say that there are also these moments where Jacob's at his kind of lowest ebb, which are in the field at twilight, and they're straight out of Terrence Malick's films. They're kind of low angled shots. Often the camera's kind of like drifted, unmooring and moving, and they serve little to no purpose to me, and there's such a diversion. And the film has quite a few of those little moments where it decides to put too much of a comment on a character for me. So I end up kind of losing out a certain emotional texture that I'm sure everybody else is experiencing, but I don't know. It's also, part of it is because it's kind of gesturing towards a film I really love, and the final card is "To All Our Grandmas," and the fact that there's a grandmother and an adorable kid puts me in mind of Edward Yang's Yi Yi, and as soon as that comparison became alive for me, I thought, oh no, because it's not going to live up to that.
I think I'm gonna agree and disagree with you there, right? Because I think I disagree with the general well, I mean, I say I disagree with Jen, because obviously I can't disagree with how you feel about it, right? But what I can say is I didn't come out with it with the same feeling. I think the thing that you've highlighted with the Malick-like shots, though, when I was talking about the film meandering, that's kind of what I had in my head. I think those are moments where it dilutes the film a little bit for me, if I'm honest. Now for me, it didn't take away, and I take your example about that scene where Sunya first comes into the film. I can see what you're saying. I can't honestly say that got in the way for me, or I can identify other points where it did. I think because for me, it felt like quite a light touch to me. And I struggle to come up with other examples where I feel like that sort of, the way something's been framed or blocked or staged or something has got in the way for me. I can see where you're coming from, but I can't say it had ended up having the same effect on me as it has.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know, just the feeling of being closed in a trailer or something like that. I mean, I maybe sort of agree in that. I also, I think we were just talking about this last film about how scenery was shot and how, the use of, how Scotland was looked at differently. And I wasn't getting anything new. I mean, maybe it's just I'm kind of sick of drone shots, but I wasn't getting anything new about the way Arkansas or, rural America was particularly framed. But that being said, I don't think this film was, the highlight of this film wasn't that for me. It was like you've all eloquently mentioned, performances and that story, and I thought it was particularly sweet, and I was very captivated by it. So watch Minari. It will be on Glasgow Film Festival, and then when is it? Is it coming out shortly thereafter in the UK?
Knows.
Okay, we're really on a roll today. All right.
Don't worry, I'll bleep myself out there. No, honestly, trying to plan this show, I've given up on looking at release dates. Thank God for film festivals, at least I know somebody's going to see it.
So be sure to check out Minari and let us know what you think at the Glasgow Film Festival. So the next film we're going to review is Apples by Christos Nikou. Steph, why don't you tell us about that film?
Yep, so basically within this film Apples, if you have seen anything by Yorgos Lanthimos, you'll be kind of familiar with the kind of Greek absurdism that you get here. It's pretty much a story about this worldwide pandemic that is causing amnesia in citizens around the world, and so you have these people who end up having a sharp shock to the head and end up not being able to recall any details of where they are, who they are, or where they're meant to be going and who their family is. So a lot of them end up in hospital with their images circulating around to try and find their family. And when they're not, when there's no one there to claim them, whether or not they don't have family, or it's one of those, whether their family's been affected by this kind of amnesiac pandemic, they end up going through a recovery program which gives them a new identity and helps them build a new life, essentially. But it's all regulated through this program, so you kind of have to live your life in a certain way to establish this identity. You don't have any leeway about how to live your life. You have to do certain tasks throughout the days to try and prove that you're building a persona as such, but everyone's sort of building the exact same replication, the exact same image of each other. So you've got this part of the world that is kind of trying to live through the system of what it means to be human, and how when you lose that part of your memory, what how society says that you should rebuild yourself and what it means to be reintegrated into society. So it's quite a wacky kind of, it's part of what I would say is quite weird cinema. It's existential, it's very philosophical, but it's one of those films that I think we have this issue when we're talking about arty and experimental films. I think not something that I've actually seen yet, but I think that sparked controversy when I'm thinking of ending things with Kaufman about the barrier between art house cinema and kind of pretentious cinema. What's the difference? What's the collide? And I think that Apples is quite good at re-establishing the kind of the functions of kind of art house cinema that is there to tell quite a central story in between it all, and it's not there to be complex for the sake of being complex, is what I would say about it. But I don't know. I really enjoyed the film. It's everything that I quite like about cinema. I don't know how you all felt about it. What did you think of the film, Jim?
I got a lot out of this. So it's been kind of rattling around in my head for a bit. So I'm going to have this weird collection of coherent thoughts and incoherent thoughts because I saw it a few months ago, and I really liked it. And I think part of it is it's one of these films where it's interesting what you brought up at the end there, Steph, because part of what I enjoyed about this is I think it's one of these films where you could be teasing out all sorts of things from it for weeks, really, on the basis of the way this is structured and some of the things that the Aris character has to, some of the tasks that he has to undertake. And particularly, it's interesting the bit you mentioned about while these people who have suffered this memory loss are needing to rebuild their life, they're basically given these prescribed tasks by the medical staff. And the thing that's really quite striking about it is these ridiculous deadpan photos that folk need to take to prove they've done something, right? And it's basically it's evidence of existence rather than feeling anything or personality or any sort of genuine human connection. And that's kind of emphasised later in the film through an interaction that Aris has. In some ways, like me, maybe it's just me, I took it, certain parts of it, particularly just one segment where he's flipping through a photo album of all these photos. To me, it felt like a bit of a comment on kind of modern social media and kind of it acting as a substitute for anything genuinely meaningful, quite frankly. But the kind of absurdist deadpan way this is presented, first of all, I got a lot out of that. That's just kind of like a sort of a tone that I think I get along with very well. But the manner in which it is presented, I found it does that thing. Like, we've spoken a lot about films that balance tone very well, right? But I think Apples is another one because it does that balancing of this absurdist, quite humorous way of looking at it, and at the same time, it's actually kind of heartbreaking. They're going through all these things, going to parties because they've been instructed to, but you can just tell from Anis's face, it feels none of it. Feels absolutely none of it. And again, it's another one where that script blends with the performances to really kind of bring home the emotions, or in this case, in some instances, the lack thereof, to be honest. So I got a lot out of it. I think this will probably get a lot of people looking at it and they'll see the word pandemic and then probably turn off, to be honest, or like not pay attention. But I actually think that what it's got going on, that framing of it is very much in the background for me. I think that the way it kind of looks at human connection, emotion, and the things that make you who you are, right, and the role that memory plays in that, I think is extremely interesting. And I think that's where the crux of the film is for me.
So it's one that I would like to watch again because I watched it. My first thing was like, I'm all over the place on this. There are scenes I think are very interesting. There's a sudden twist moment, which is tremendous, and then not tremendous, because it's played so... It's partially to do with the actor who's Aris Servatalis, who is very lanky, has very laconic tendencies, has a great trimmed beard, and when he's doing the twist, he has like such long legs that his movements are so carefully delineated and look as though if you weren't looking at his face, you'd be like, oh, someone's having a good time. But you're looking at his face going, the guy's an autopilot, he's not feeling a thing. I do think that he's a brilliant camera subject. So when he's doing small things like peeling the apple. He's really interesting to watch peel an apple, and that's not something you can say about lots of actors. So the film has that going for it. The social media aspect to it, which at first was kind of passed me by entirely, but it's the moment when Aris meets Anna at the cinema, and there's a woman following who's also part of this new identity program. And what she does is they all take photos with the poster of the film that they've just seen as one of the tasks that they've been set. And the woman after Anna and Aris takes it as a selfie. The other two put it down and put it on a timer and pose with the poster. What this woman does after them is takes it just literally like a selfie, like anybody would do in daily life. And that's the moment where it's like, okay, yes, it's a social media allegory. As a social media allegory, I'm not very interested in it. It's one of these movies that plays on negative space, a little bit like Limbo, where there's so much negative space above them, and it's a bit of a comment on the fact that they're amnesiac, as though because they're amnesiac, they're not full subjects, they don't deserve a fully proportioned frame for them in, and I'm not interested in that either. I will say, however, that the Yorgos Lanthimos comparisons, and I would say also the Sangari comparisons are worthwhile, and they're worthwhile in this way because the lead actor has starred in 2 of Lanthimos' movies. He was in Kineta and he was in Alps. The director was second assistant director on Dogtooth, and the fact that there are unclaimed amnesiacs is very much like the Singles Hotel and the Lobster. Like the Lanthimos comparison is quite a full one. I would also say that as much as I don't like parts of this film, this is a much better film than anything I've seen of Lanthimos' so far, so it's got that going for it. It does have lots of little scenes that suggest that it's funnier than it is. It has moments with windshield wipers, it has a moment on a swimming pool, diving board that's like a skit from Mr. Bean. It's a movie that I don't really care about, if that's not too mean to say. It has a certain understatedness, and then
I'm trying to decide whether that's not mean or incredibly mean.
I just don't really care about it. There are things like the fact that the guy who gives the tasks over the tape recorder has a voice like the voice of Saw in the Saw movies. That's funny to me in a strange way, but I can't put this together as a full, and appropriately for a movie about amnesiacs, I can't put this together as a full experience because it has lots of little curlicues and scenes that just appear like false appendages to me. So maybe I'll stop moaning about it now.
I think that the film is very allegorical, and I think when you go back to what Jim said about social media and Mark echoed that about the problem with how everything's digitalized and sent everywhere, and what is authentic anymore is one of the big questions in this. I will accept the social media. What I think that people will see that either as something that's quite a good way to explore that topic, or people will find it quite jarring. I think there's no in between there. I think that what will annoy me is if this gets compared to COVID or the COVID pandemic, which I can see coming in quite a few reviews because of, I think the word pandemic in the current situation we jump to, it's a tale about COVID in a new way. I think if you watch it, it's really not anything, other than there being a pandemic. There's not really any comparison to, I think, what's happening just now. It's very much more of I was the same as Mark. I immediately kind of went back to The Lobster. That was the film that came to mind when I was watching it. So there is obviously quite a big Lanthimos influence on this, and I think like his films, it's not just kind of one core question. There's a few different parallels that you can draw from these films and different things that you can, and it's not. I think you can go down a very linear path of the question of memory and what does memory mean and how does that really make us who we are, and then I think you can go down what is that saying about how we're now broadcasting everything on social media. Are we actually living these experiences? Can we remember living them, or is it all just kind of saved on a drive somewhere to be revisited without actually having any kind of tactile recollections of those days? So I think it's one of those films that is very much very much quite absurd. It's very much a kind of one of those films that is not going to be an easy watch. You've kind of have to get quite focused into it if you want to get anything out of it. And not saying that, I don't think that if you don't get anything out of it, that's necessarily anything to do with you. I think it's one of those films that, either gels with you or doesn't. It's something, I think, as well as Lanthimos. I think if you're a fan of the films of Roy Andersson, you might quite like this movie. I think it goes into the existential despairs and questions that he kind of goes into, the meanings of existence and things. It's very much a film that revels in its absurdity, in a sense.
So I think the main thing, the main idea is that I did gel with it very strongly, I think. And one place where I'm not going to disagree with Marc, but I'm going to offer a counter perspective, shall we say. The social media allegory, which came through very strongly for me. I think, for me, the strength of that one, and I think what interested me in it, because, I don't want to be too old man yells at cloud about it. Like social media, you can complain about social media all day long, right? But I think what was interesting about it in this film is the fact that the film itself is kind of a drift of time and place, or at least I certainly couldn't place it as being in a particular time period. There wasn't, or certainly I don't recall any smartphones, and the instructions that they're getting delivered by the medical staff, it's done by cassette tape, and it's kind of the whole thing has got this kind of like retro aesthetic about it. And I think what I found quite striking about these photos of these experiences, where you can tell nobody is really getting anything emotional out of it, and then it's getting flipped through a photo album as opposed to like a camera roll or something. For me, it's once you take the modern aspect out of it and then the idea of any particularly modern technology, it kind of shows up quite how absurd some of this stuff is. And for me, that was an interesting way to do it, because anybody can say social media is bad, these people are not your friends, blah blah, whatever the hell you want to say about it. But I think once you take it back and you remove it from modern technology and modern trends, to me, that made a stronger statement than anything that you could say overtly, right? So for me, that's where the interest gets, and I think that's for me where it's a little bit different. I will also actually say I think I gelled this a little bit stronger than some of the work I've seen from Lanthimos, if I'm being honest. So that's probably where there's maybe a similarity there. I would say that I was probably one person where I got a lot out of this film. But as I say, to go back to what I was saying at the start, I think it's one of these things where people will find different aspects of it interesting. That's the one I kind of glommed onto, but I think other people will probably pick different things out of it, or indeed, as is the case with Marc, will find the bit that I found interesting not particularly interesting. So I think it's a movie with quite a lot of layers to it, I think, and I'd be interested to see what other people took from it.
Great. So Apples, check it out on Glasgow Film Festival. So the final film we're going to review is Frederick Wiseman's next film, observational documentary, City Hall. And I will let Marc go and tell us about this film, since he is the number one Wiseman fan I know.
It's a great honour. So City Hall is Frederick Wiseman's newest documentary. It centres, as you would imagine, City Hall, this one in Boston, Massachusetts. It's structured in a way that kind of bifurcates. It, on the one hand, is kind of a portrait of the mayor, Marty Walsh. So in a way, it's kind of like at Berkeley, in the way that it centered one person while also looking kind of in a panoramic way at how the institution works apart from that person, but obviously aware of his influence. And then City Hall also kind of goes around the different places in the city that have connections to the work and the policies that are enacted in City Hall. So that really does it in terms of plot synopsis. That's all you need to know. And then the film is 4.5 hours of, as Amanda mentioned, observation, direct observation. There's only one person in the entire film who looks at the camera at all. as a guy who kind of cheekily interacts with the camera, which is a complete no-no usually in Wiseman movies. He just edits out people who look at the camera, I'd imagine. So the themes that we would need to be delineating from the film are the way that Walsh operates. A lot of the film is Walsh's appearances, media appearances at, there's one at a food bank where he's kind of part of a drive. The food bank has a mascot, which I found mind-boggling. Because there's so much detail in a Wiseman movie, there are umpteen things to pick up about them. They're rife with contradictions. They're rife with strange things and bits of what would look like ephemera, but end up kind of rebounding on each other. And the editing in the film's like an echo chamber in a way. Something that comes up in the first hour will reappear in the fourth, and eventually be tied up into a more cohesive thematic element to the film. I will say that homelessness is an enormous focus in this film, and a number of the meetings are about the work of homeless shelters, the work of charities who work with people who are suffering as part of the opioid crisis. There's also a huge emphasis on racial justice, gender equity as part of the work of the city and in all the businesses that are connected to the city. The film, I would say, is an adulatory portrait of Walsh and the work that Walsh's staffers all do, but it's also, I think, subtly not undermining him, but looking at the margins as well, looking where people aren't being, kind of clasped by Walsh's rhetoric. And there's a part towards the end of the film which is a lot like the kind of exquisite rhetorical work that goes on in Ex Libris. There's a meeting about a cannabis dispensary, and this is a meeting which happens just at the end of the fourth hour and the beginning of the fifth. So it might be a task to work it out, but the cannabis dispensary is one of the first moments where someone in a meeting actually answers the person speaking back. And it's a moment where a rhetorical contest of sorts, not, aggressive, but passionate, where members of the local community talk back to the people who are trying to, set up, institute a cannabis dispensary in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Boston, in Dorchester. And they have amazing things to say about what this means for them. Is it going to be a positive thing in the community? They accept that the people trying to set up the dispensary mean well, but they're getting them to be absolutely drum tight in the way that it's going to be open, so that it affects the community in a positive way. And they say there are amazing arguments that they make, which did remind me of the arguments in Ex Libris to an extent. I'll stop talking for a minute. Amanda, what did you think of City Hall?
I think the one thing that's interesting is that I've seen a lot of his films that deal with institutions and art galleries and things like that, and so it was interesting to me because I've not seen as many as you have about taking on government, and also particularly just because I spent so much time in New York and didn't spend time in Boston. There's a huge rivalry between those two cities. But I think that adulatory mention that you had really does ring true. I did feel like it was kind of showing a really positive light to city government that I didn't expect. Maybe I kind of thought to uncover stuff. And I also felt like, unlike a lot of other films I feel like I've seen, while yes, sure, the head of the National Gallery or, the person running the opera or whatnot, ballet, was an important character that you would constantly go back to. I felt like this one was and you mentioned another film that maybe that was the case, but this is the first one I saw that I really thought there was like a primary character, which was the mayor. And, he was the most political, not that I disagreed with his politics by any means. But it definitely brought, it definitely showed that the government is working, is functionally working in Boston. And I don't know if that's something I would have even guessed in some case, and did quite enjoy all the accents and whatnot. But yeah, I did feel like it was interesting to see some earnest, like you mentioned, the conversation that was happening with the residents in Dorchester. That was a really powerful moment for me. I also really enjoyed the moments with the veterans. But then when the mayor came up and kind of gave his speech, it always seemed like he had to come in and kind of give an exclamation point to it. So maybe it was just my own personal annoyance with him sometimes. But yeah, I found it very, very the way I like a Wiseman film, and something I learned from that, and I don't know. I mean, I think sometimes, I know this is probably a really, really bad example, but like when you look at the show The Wire, that kind of took different segments of a city. I think the way that this is able to to go through various components of city life and what they have to deal with, and even just sometimes it's quite funny, like stop yelling at me, or I particularly really enjoyed the moments where the people are pleading for their tickets, and how pleasant the people who gave them reprieves were on their parking tickets, because that was not the experience I had in Jersey City or New York. So it almost made me want to move to Boston. That will never happen, but in any case, I did think it was a celebration more than I expected. So and I appreciate that.
I think I've got less experience with Frederick Wiseman than I think either of you. This is only the second one of his films I've seen. The other one being Ex Libris, the one about the New York Public Library. I got a lot out of this. This is going to sound like I'm damning with faint praise, but I'm not. I enjoyed it, I think, as much as you can in a 4.5-hour documentary about local government. But I think the point, but I'm not being facetious there. It is genuinely really good. And I think part of what I liked about it is the way that it stitches together the role that government and local government in this sense plays with the local community, and that in both a positive and a negative sense. I think it does show bits where people are looking for more from their local authorities, and it highlights maybe where they're not doing as well as they should. But at the same time, and I think this is probably added a little bit more punch by the time and place in which it came out, right? So I think it first popped up at Venice last year, and then it's gone on a big, huge kind of festival tour, both virtual and otherwise, since then, ahead of the US election. I can't recall Trump being mentioned explicitly. I mean, he's alluded to. I think he probably is at some point, but I can't quite remember when. And it is kind of the elephant in the room. But what's good about this film, or what I liked about it, is it kind of just shows how government should work. Now, and when I say that, I don't mean that, the mayor of Boston is, doing a stellar job and everything he should, or any of the local authorities are. I just more meaning that they're getting about their work, right? There's a lack of reality television about it, which I think there has been for quite some time. And I think the fact that this is the documentary that he has made speaks to the time and place in the United States it was made in. And I got a lot out of it. And I think part of what really brought that feeling home to me are just the numerous segments throughout the film where we move away from whatever public meeting is happening, or whatever speech the mayor is making, anything like that. And basically, really, either the camera will just sit on a street corner for an extended period of time, or it will cycle through shots of local businesses and spots and things like that. And it kind of, to me, really got across a real sense of the role that this institution plays in that community. And there's that link there, which to me is where kind of the real heart of the film, for me anyway, came in. So I got a lot out of that, and I think the fact that this is as long as it is allows that to sink in. I think if you were to skim the surface of this and not show the breadth of the way that this actually touches people's day-to-day lives would lessen the impact of that. So I got a lot out of it, and I find it interesting that's the topic covered at this particular time in American political history.
Yeah, and it'd be worth saying too that Wiseman refers to his films as reality fictions, which, as you can imagine, is a phrase I'm enamored of. And what this does is it means that every decision he makes in the film is an interpretation, because he has an enormous amount of condensation of material to carry out. So those sequences, Jim, you're mentioning, those kind of pillow shots of the city, they end up being like the film in miniature in a way, because what are they shots of? They're shots of businesses, but which businesses are they? They're shots of Thai restaurants, Vietnamese supermarkets. They're shots of Dominican takeaways. Like they're making the point about who lives in Boston and that it's a majority minority town. The other major part of those pillow shots are houses, and as I mentioned, this is a film so much about housing, and there's a point where they mention the proposal to roll back on the Fair Housing Act, which will make people vulnerable to evictions, and there's so many meetings throughout the film which are about trying to tackle that, but the Trump administration, which I think does get an explicit mention at one point, but it's largely just referred to as the current administration, which I think is right. Two, I think it's so much a film about language, and the way in which, as Amanda mentioned when Walsh turns up at the veterans meeting, he has his rhetorical style depends so much upon pathos. It depends so much upon personalizing politics, sometimes to a fault, because he has those moments where he turns up and just makes it about his own story, which they're quite funny in a way. He turns up at the meeting full of Latinx staffers and just starts talking about his Irish roots, and he turns up at the veterans meeting and starts talking about his experiences in recovery, and you're like, he's kind of overstepping a mark, but he's also got a casualness and a lack of bureaucraties that gets him away with it. Like he's just a guy who's just particularly good at his job. That is obviously PR'd to the nth degree. He's obviously been like trained at this and is extremely good at this, but it does speak to the way that language and discourse and discursive terms are kind of the heart of any working democracy. And then you can ask, is it a working democracy at that time? I also want to point out the moments where it goes into portraits of labour, because so many of Wiseman's films are themselves portraits of labour. And not only are they portraits of labour, they are themselves enormous acts of labour. This is 4.5 hours long. There's a great deal of work to be done here. So there are moments like the amazing sequence with the guys throwing trash for the city, and things thrown onto the trash compactor that just, you don't, like, that can't fit there. That grill surely will not be crushed by this compactor, and it is. And he has these close-ups of their hands pulling the levers, and those scenes are so exciting to me. And it's worth mentioning too that we can talk about subject matter till we're blue in the face, but Wiseman is, or I should say his cameraman, his camera person, John Davey, is extraordinarily good at finding beautiful images just casually, out of nowhere. For instance, I know that there are lots of complaints about Boston skyline as an aesthetic object, but I found the way that he made buildings kind of converge on each other here, it's really, really beautiful. And in a number of the ones that are of City Hall, again, it does the thing in miniature, which is City Hall is shown jutting into the next building, just as the things that go on in City Hall affect everyone in the city. So I think that there are umpteen things still to mention that we could probably get to, but I will say that I don't think this is one of Wiseman's best films. I think it's very good, but it's not Welfare or Hospital or Near Death, and Ex Libris and In Jackson Heights, which I think is the movie this is probably closest to in terms of the diversity of the space which it takes as its subject, and the amount that meetings play a part of things. But I think ultimately this comes back to a certain level of utopianism that has creeped into the films from, I would say, maybe National Gallery onwards, with the exception of Monrovia, Indiana, which is kind of unfairly pegged as his Trump movie. I think this has got a certain strain of American optimism in it, but it's not the naive kind. It goes for documenting what's good about the process of this particular city government, but also shows where it has to go further. And it's, as I mentioned, that Dorchester meeting where a number of the residents can't turn up. Again, we're talking about language, because they're Cape Verdean migrants and they don't speak English. So they need to have the material translated for them to be part of the political process. So the point ultimately being that yes, Walsh is doing a good job, and City Hall is working as pretty well. There's always more to do. There are always more people to include, and the people who aren't included currently, guess who they are? They're poor and they're mostly not white. And I think that that's the point that this all kind of coalesces around.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I guess it was much more utopian than I expected, and at the same time, there was a lot more pathos than I expected. Like, I mean, there was just these scenes. Not to say that that doesn't exist in his other films, of course it does. But I think that sometimes I just felt like with the arts administration ones, it was a very much like, this is the details of what we do when we put on, an exhibit, and this is 5 minutes of a guy, putting a light up, and these moments, and the people working on the ground in the city, trying and fighting for people within the city is I mean, I also kind of remember the guy who went with the eviction notice or something around that, where the veteran was kind of giving his whole information out to him, and I mean, but the way that he responded so sympathetically to that person, the wedding was a special moment too. So I was really impressed, and I enjoyed it. I just didn't. I guess I was a little bit more like, oh, you normally get upset with city governments because they hand you tickets, but I think it allows you to see, the massive amount of work and effort that goes into running a city, and the amount of people that that require this effort, and that there are really like really valuable people who in that process. So and they're obviously, like you said, dealing with the current administration, who is probably just making everything incredibly hard on them. So yeah, I mean, I highly enjoyed it, and but I knew I would. So
yeah, I was expecting to as well, obviously, but I would say that there are a couple of moments where I can't quite work out where things fit into the structure. They're not organically pieced in. There's a kind of detour to the outskirts of the city, which then go to a library which has a massive collection of ceramics, and then to a botanic center. And that detour felt like it could have there should have been a neater stitching to it. It's kind of just, we're going out now, and then next scene back into City Hall again, and it felt like a bit of a jump, and I couldn't work out exactly why the rhythm faltered at that minute. But I'll end by saying I really love the parking violation hearing scenes as well, because they're kind of totemic of what people expect. Like, the expectations of going to a parking violation hearing are, God, I'm going to get stiffed by a low-level bureaucrat who's as bored as I am with this whole process. And that's not what happens, because they're sympathetic. No. They realize people have lives. They realize that one of the people is a dad who was under very harried circumstances. The other person, who turns up an older man, was like, I didn't realize people lived here. They take it at face value, because it's how life is like. It's what life is like, and they're extremely personable in those scenes, and I found that very heartening.
I wonder if Frederick Wiseman did one on Edinburgh City Council, what it would look like. If it would look anything
it'd be
like
so
that.
Dull.
Oh, who knows? Anyway, City Hall is Glasgow Film Festival, of course, and check it out. We recommend it. It's 4.5 hours long, though, so give yourself some time. So I'm joined here with Paul Sng, who's the co-director of Poly Styrene, I'm A Cliché. Paul, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Amanda.
Great. And your film is this the UK premiere of the film, or
It's
is it?
actually the world premiere at Glasgow.
Oh, wonderful. Great. It's a world premiere, so very exciting. So tell me a little bit about the background of how the film got started. I know you're based in Edinburgh, but how did you kind of come across the theme in the film?
Yeah, well, when we first sort of met one another, Celeste and I, and our writer Zoe Howe, I was living in Brighton. This was back in 2016, and I'd met Zoe. We'd done a couple of Q&As together, and I'd said to her, offhand, if you ever have any ideas for music docs, give us a shout. It'd be good to collaborate. And she had three really good ideas. One of which was Poly, because Celeste and Zoe were working on a book about polystyrene. So we met with Celeste in a cafe in London. I think it was December 2016, and I sort of pitched an idea to them about how I maybe saw the film, which was to choose some iconic locations in Polly's life and explore them in the present day, with Celeste. And also I asked Celeste if she'd be willing to kind of write some letters to her mum to sort of open like a dialogue. And they were interested in that approach, and over time we developed that idea. And rather than letters, the basis of those letters then became Celeste's voiceover in the film. Celeste became much more present in the film as well, in terms of we see Celeste. She is a character in the film that has almost as much prominence as her mum, really. And then from there we talked about the type of film we wanted to make. I didn't really want to do talking heads again, because I'd done that on my first two films. And I guess inspired by Asif Kapadia and his style of making films, where we hear voices, but we also see archive. We went that way, and it obviously was. I think it paid off. But using archive is expensive, and I guess that's why it's prohibitive a lot of the time in clearing it all for the rights. But ultimately, I think it made the film a lot more immersive. I mean, when you're hearing people talking about being in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. You get a much richer picture of it when you can see footage from that period and just hear the voice. Whereas if you were seeing, people, Vivienne Westwood or Don Letts in a room in the present day, I think it's a bit more difficult as an audience to immerse yourself in the period. So that was kind of how it came together, really.
Yeah, no, that's very fascinating. And I did think of things like Amy and Supersonic certainly come to mind, but also very much personal stories. Like one of my favorite documentaries was My Architect, and the stories we tell. So I do think seeing it through the lens of Celeste is really powerful. And you kind of did give a really good overview on how you came with that. On the archive material, it's really a fascinating mixture. How did you approach that, of finding all of that? I know it can be quite complicated, and as you mentioned, very expensive. But what was that process for you?
I mean, initially we had an archive researcher who worked on the film, and we kind of gave her a rough brief, and then latterly Celeste took on that role as well, along with our editor Zana, who we had an idea of what our story was, and then it was just a case of exploring various archives. I mean, the majority of it is from Getty, but we also used Kino. There was another library that we used that was a smaller one, based in Hastings. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting. I mean, I think the inspiration for the archive was, films by Julian Temple. And I'm thinking of The Filth and the Fury. There's a lot of great archive from the 70s, but we didn't want to tap into that same, 70s punk archive that you always see. We did want it to be a bit more creative. So, as we were making the film, we would all come up with suggestions. I mean, at one point, I think I suggested The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, because it was a film I'd seen a long time ago. And in terms of the film's mood, I mean, there are moments in the story where it's kind of like a fairy tale, and we wanted it to kind of have, that sense of wonder, and I guess that sense of fear that children sometimes have. Because when Celeste was young, and she was living in the temple, the Hare Krishna temple, and she talks about when she escaped and crawled out of the window, the language that she uses is very fairy tale-esque. And I think in terms of the archive that you see, I mean, it does match up with what you're hearing, but it isn't always directly what you hear is what you see. It's a lot more creative than that, really.
Absolutely. And it's yeah, it's a fascinating amount of material. Although I did find it interesting when you're kind of doing, you don't do reenactments, but you take, Celeste kind of takes a tour through, you know, parts of her life. Like she goes to New York, and I lived in New York for a bit, and one of the saddest things was CBGB's is, you know, now gone. So I liked
Yeah.
how you artfully kind of, you know, emulated the experience of a place like that. But yeah, really sort of a mixture between those beautiful shots of, you know, Celeste going through kind of her so yeah, how long did it take for you to kind of make the whole film, I guess is the question.
It was a long time comparatively compared to other things I've done. I mean, we had the initial concept, I guess, early 2017. We raised some money in a crowdfunding campaign around April 2017. Ultimately, it wasn't enough to finish the film, and then it took a long time to bring the rest of the funding in. And we were very lucky that we had a couple of private investors come in, and Sky commissioned the film, so that brought in some money, and then Screen Scotland and BFI Doc Society. So thanks to all of those people, we were able to finish the film. But it's interesting, you know, what you're saying about CBGB's, and now it's, you know, a fashion emporium. And I think going there and filming there was an irony to that, in that, you know, Poly, as you know, wrote a lot about consumerism and the consumerist society and what that meant in terms of art and everything else. And it's it's a bitter irony that this, you know, great you know, venue of punk back in the day is now, you know, a retail outlet, and they've preserved a lot of the features, but I don't know, it's a bit like Madame Tussauds in a way. It's not really real, but we're very grateful that they, you know, allowed us to film there, so I'm not going to say bad things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I didn't even know that's where it still is like they kind of have a museum to it. I lived in the East Village for a long time, and I just suppose it is really interesting that, like, at her you kind of make that point when she, you know, she reaches New York. That's a critical moment for her and what she sees. And I guess as someone who's doing the opposite, who's lived now in Edinburgh in the UK, I didn't know Poly Styrene's, you know, I'm not from that generation, but I also you know, didn't know much about her, about her life until I saw this film. So you talked about the crowdfunding, like is there a huge, massive pop, you know, like does she have a bunch of fans from the previous that kind of contributed, or how did you go about the kind of, like you said, sort of securing all the funding through all those various things?
Yeah, I mean, Polly has a really big fan base in terms of X-Ray Specs fans and people that like her and her music and what she stood for as an artist. So when we launched that, which was via Indiegogo back in, I think it was about April 2017, we got a lot of press everywhere, really, and we raised our target. And then lastly, we did a Patreon, which also brought in some money. But I think it helps when you're trying to raise, you know, money through a crowdfunding campaign. You either need to have a really, you know, hot idea that a lot of people are going to, you know, be interested in, that has some kind of universal appeal, maybe, or whatever you're making needs to have an existing audience, and often musicians or artists do have that already. And it's interesting in making the film. I mean, crowdfunding is tricky, it's challenging, but if you do well and, you know, you raise your target, what it does help with is it enables you to identify that you have an audience in place. And we knew that already, but it just reinforced how much love there was out there for Poly Styrene, you know, because she touched lives. I mean, she wasn't a household name maybe in the way that, you know, Susie Sue or Chrissy Hind is, but in terms of, you know, how she inspired people, you know, considering she, you know, left behind a comparatively sort of smaller body of work than, say, some of the other punk artists. She honestly did touch people. People were inspired. I think by her originality, by her honesty, and also just by her integrity. You know, she didn't sell out. You know, she could have made those decisions to have more longevity as a career and make more money, but, you know, I think as an artist, she was someone that had, you know, was more interested in art and what it meant than selling records. And I think that's, you know, commendable, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And it definitely came across in the film. And I was really moved by her story personally. But I also thought it was really interesting that she, you know, she obviously represented this iconoclast at that era. And then she was still battling these, the issues of fame and all of that. And I think it's such a really powerful film that if people who push against that as much as possible are still having to, I mean, there's a vulnerability there in your story. So it's really, I mean, were you a big fan before, or is it just that, yeah, I mean, how did this personally make you kind of learn more about her story?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say I was a big fan. I mean, I was a fan. I knew, obviously, by Bondage Up Yours, I knew the album Germ for Adolescence. But often when I'm approaching a story, for me, wanting to learn more about the subject or the participant and go on a journey really with them is important. So I learned, pretty much most of what I now know about Poly Styrene through making that film. There was a lot of information out there already, and from one of the first times of speaking to Celeste, a lot of those kind of bits of false information that are on Wikipedia, that are on the internet, such as the fact that I don't know if it still says it on her Wikipedia page, but at one point it was that her dad was a Somali aristocrat, which is absolute rubbish. I think maybe Polly had said that jokingly in an interview once, and it got picked up on. So I learned a lot more, and I already knew Germ for Adolescence as an album, but I grew to be. So it's still an album, even after making the film, that I can listen to regularly and listen to it all the way through. Whereas sometimes when you're making a film and you have a bit of distance after doing it, but that hasn't really happened yet. And I think that's just because the songs are so good. The songwriting is she isn't I wouldn't, she's not a punk artist. She's someone that writes just pop tunes really, but that appealed to that punk audience at the time.
Yeah, and I often think, I mean, I'm a documentary filmmaker myself, but you become kind of the world expert on these subjects, and really like take a journey with these, these people that you're so it is quite interesting to see how how that's changed over time. What without knowing too much about what you've done before, what kind of work are you looking into doing going forward? Do you have things planned in terms of your work?
Yeah, I mean, my work really, the first few things I've done have tended to focus on people who kind of challenge the status quo in some way, and Polly is obviously one of them. I'm also interested in issues of representation around people or subjects that have been, neglected, marginalised, misrepresented. So the next film I'm going to be making is about a photographer called Tish Murtha, who was a working class woman from the northeast of England, whose career was, on an upward trajectory when she was, in her early 20s, and was kind of sort of then on hold when she had her daughter and never really recovered. And Tish was, as someone who documented, poverty in some of her work, which was something she wanted to escape but never really did. So I am interested in kind of, exploring stories that, if they have taken place in the past, there's still a relevance today. And of course, we're seeing even, greater levels of inequality than the ones that Tish described in her photographs 40 years ago. So yeah, that's the next one anyway.
Great. Well, I think obviously this film is so resonant today, and it was a real pleasure to watch and a real pleasure to talk to you. So Poly Styrene, I Am A Cliché is world premiering at what day of the Glasgow Film Festival?
It's on Saturday, the 27th of February.
Saturday, 27th of February. So yeah, everybody, please check it out. And Paul, thanks again for your time.
Thank you.
So that's our reviews of the Glasgow Film Festival. There's plenty more to watch out for. And Jim and Marc, do you have any thoughts on films that people should think about checking out?
Yeah, no, there's a few. I think one that's definitely worth checking out, and I'm hoping we might talk about it on a future edition of the show, actually, is Black Bear. Not that I want to have too much of a Sundance 2020 feel to the show, right? Because we've already spoken about Minari. It's a film which I think I'll be interested to see what people make of it. I think I could see some people taking quite strongly against it. I got a lot out of it. It's not perfect by any means, but it's a very interesting film, and I think that's one that's really worth catching, and hopefully we'll speak about. Riders of Justice is an interesting one, and I think I think we've mentioned before, Mads Mikkelsen's beard in that film is particularly spot on, I think. The film itself is maybe a little bit rockier, but I think that's a good one that people will enjoy watching. Right? I think cards on the table. I think there's better films playing at the festival, but I certainly enjoyed it. There's a variety of other films which are pretty good. Unfortunately, with our broadcast time, I can't talk about them just yet because a couple of them are world premieres. But there's definitely interesting stuff kicking around. I think all the films we've spoken about, Black Bear, Riders of Justice, that's one that I'd pick out as well. So there's definitely a lot to recommend. I think it's one of these programs where just dip in and see what you fancy. But those are the two that I can talk about that I would say are probably worth checking out.
Yeah, and anyone else?
So because we're kind of hamstrung by what we can talk about, I can say that there are certain directors who I'm interested in seeing their films and would suggest, if anybody's interested in, say, the films of Anoka Sawicha-Kornpong, she has a short that's playing as part of an anthology movie called Mekong 2030. There's a movie which doesn't have an embargo, just confirming this, called Castro's Spies documentary, that is the kind of thing that could very feasibly end up on BBC Storyville as their 80-minute documentary. I don't think it's brilliant, but I do think it has a kind of an interesting angle and is put together in a pretty fleet way. It kind of goes through the story of the 5 Castro spies, or the 10 Castro spies who were captured in the 90s, and 5 of them held out on cooperating with the Americans. It is a really interesting story, and if you've seen Olivier Assayas's Wasp Network and the complete narrative crash and mess of that film, which I quite like some of it, but I couldn't make sense of who was where doing what and why, and this movie contextualizes it quite a lot. I'll say I'm looking forward to, and I've heard good things about, Preparations to Be Together for an Unknown Period of Time, directed by Lily Horvath, and I have already seen this but can't really say anything about. I'll be creative and say I'm looking forward to watching First Cow again, and that's it.
Of course, First Cow, because it got added. I forgot about that.
Yeah, and there's quite a lot of interesting documentaries, I think, on the program that I'm interested in. I'm interested in the one that's I'll probably pronounce it, Urim, which is a boat song, which is completely done in Gaelic. That one seems really interesting. Also, Eye of the Storm, which is about a Scottish painter, James Morrison, but has a soundtrack from Karine Polwart. So again, I think you mentioned that completely, Jim. It's just it's a nice mixture of like really popular films over the that's maybe have made it to other film festivals over the year, but also Scottish, a real Scottish take to it. So some really great films that you should check out. And it would be smart for us to tell you how to. So glasgowfilm.org. Check out Glasgow Film Festival. It's interesting. You can definitely buy one-on-one tickets, but there's also bundles. And as I mentioned, I think from my experience so far, the way in which you can watch the films is quite easy, and it's quite lovely. You can stream it to your laptop but also your TV and stuff like that. So it's really well done, I think, really well curated. So we really enjoyed doing this Glasgow Film Festival special for a second time, and we're looking forward to doing it again, and hopefully we'll all be able to go back in person by then. I don't want to jinx us. Did I just do that?
I really feel like we should just record you saying that, and then we could just continue adding it to the end of every episode. Hopefully we'll be able to see each other in person sometime again.
Well, I mean, at a Glasgow Film Festival someday. It's killing me. I was looking at pictures actually of us recording this year or something like that a couple days ago when we did the one last year, and there was like 6 of us in the EHFM studio, and it was
which is not a big studio.
No, it's not, and it was frightening and and nostalgic all the same. But anyway, so guys have exciting film plans finishing out this Glasgow Film Festival things this month. What's on your plans?
Well, not content with taking up my time with a million film festivals, I've got another one. So there'll be South by Southwest at the start of March. I'm accredited for that, so theoretically I should, actually try to write something for that. I was actually accredited for it last year, and I was going to try and wing it and get screeners and stuff, but of course then I got cancelled during the pandemic. Yeah. So this is another one of these little milestones a year on. So no, that's coming up, and then I think Glasgow Short Film Festival looks interesting, and that's happening at the end of March. So I just checking out what's going on. I don't think I'm going anywhere to a cinema anytime soon before we next do a show. So yeah,
that's fair. And Steph, how about you?
I'm still I'm just recently signed up for my BFI accreditation, so I'm waiting for that to come through, so hopefully I can see the best from the fest of that. And I'm actually still kind of playing a bit catch up from last year. I missed out on Nomadland from the London Film Fest last year, so I'm very excited to catch that this year. It's been on I've been hearing so many good things about it. It's been on my mind for the past year, so I'm just going to be excited when that's finally released and I can catch that.
Great. And Marc, have you finished your Wiseman Weismanathon, or are you still going? Because 19 films plus I don't know how many Frederick Wiseman, all in a month, and some writing papers. It blows me away, actually.
So I have run out in that I can't find any more. There are still some to see. I just can't spot them anywhere. I think I can't remember how many it is I did consecutively. It was basically a Wiseman a night for several weeks. And so that's quite a few. So I've seen maybe like 34 of his films now. And
wow.
it's been fun. It's also been extremely draining because those films are long and some of them are very tough, although the toughest one, which has got a little bit of a connection to City Hall, is maybe the best one of the best documentaries I've ever seen, which is a way of saying it's one of the best films I've ever seen, is Near Death, which, as you would imagine from that title, is not a cheery movie at all, but it's one of those like essential documents that have to be seen. There are also fun ones, and I'm sure we can talk about them at a later date. But yeah, the Wiseman's been fun, for the most part, and I'm also doing BFI Flair next month, and once that's done, it's going to be dissertation. So not a lot more.
Are you writing your dissertation on Frederick Wiseman?
No, I don't think so. I want to give him a break for a while. I'll come back to.
Because you would have been prepared.
I feel like if you don't, you've missed an opportunity for synchronizing interests there.
I'll come back to Fred at a later date, recharge.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us again, and we'll see you in a future episode. Hopefully the next one, if not the one after. Thanks again. And again, thank you for joining us. And always feel free to write us back. And we're at Cinetopia on Twitter and at Cinetopia Hub on Instagram, cinetopiashow.com. See you next time.